This is Jessica Quinn, and this is my project for the BLED 6110 course, The Socio-Political Context, Overrepresentation of English Language Learners in Special Education. As an overview of the presentation, I'll be talking about socio-political context, social factors, political factors related to the context, and some New Mexico-specific factors. I selected this topic because my overarching research agenda is in the area of early childhood special education with a focus on communication. To relate my topic with this course, I'm aligning the needs of bilingual education students in the special education setting. Since communication can be a bridge across the two topics, I felt it was relevant to my future research. I think this topic fits the criteria for a socio-political issue because students that are English language learners and students that are nonverbal are often misrepresented in standardized tests. These misrepresentations can impact the trajectory of a student's educational experience and further perpetuate a cycle of low socioeconomic status, which in turn constrains the opportunities for social mobility and empowerment. Here in the Southwest, we are familiar with students that come from homes where Spanish is the first language, and I will use that as an example many times. However, I remind you to consider that this is not unique to our region or to the Spanish language. And now to make some definitions. English language learners, or ELLs, are students that are labeled as English language learners identified through a formal assessment that tests reading, writing, speaking, and listening comprehension, and either the parent or the teacher can initiate this kind of assessment. Beyond the assessment, the parent can still decide if the child participates in a dual language program. The federal government requires schools to monitor academic progress for up to 2 years if identified. Defining the special education learner, or SPED, a student identified as having a disability was provided procedural safeguards to include ruling out the lack of educational opportunity, language, or vision and hearing loss as the root of the educational concern. Then a full individual evaluation was performed where the student qualified under one or more of the 13 categories defined by the federal government under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Autism, blindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impaired, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment make up the 13 categories. In looking at the intersectionality of ELL SPED students, research has been conducted in the intersectionality in 4 special ed categories: learning disabled, or LD, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, speech language impairment, or SLI, and specific learning disability, or SLD. Learners can intersect in multiple categories. I want you to think for just a moment about why those 4 specific categories would be more important to consider as intersecting when compared with the other categories from the 13. And now for the framework of this project, I looked at Bandura's social cognitive theory, which is looking into recognizing that a teacher may perceive themselves as having the tools and knowledge they need to provide adequate supports for ELL students, but do not feel equipped to teach special education students. So when a teacher does not see the progress with an ELL, they're quick to refer to special education rather than look further into specific language supports an ELL might need. Speaking a language other than English has been perceived as a barrier and has a long-standing trajectory of racism. That brings me to disability critical race theory, or DISCRIT, and that's looking at how patterns of oppression traverse in the school experience. How is it that a student labeled as a special education student can have imposed stereotypes unnecessarily, and then the experiences in the school can lead to later dropout and aversions to the school system? The United States has evolved over the years in many social justices. These timelines that we're going to briefly look at are in both bilingual education and special education. These were pretty cool timelines, and you can see here if you just hover over the different links, will give you more information. But for the purposes of time, I just wanted to show you that the first law was enacted in 1839, and it was in the state of Ohio, and then many things occur and are currently changing every single day. So the last Proposition 58 happened in California, and schools are no longer required to teach English language learners in English-only programs. So in looking at school districts and how they have to get feedback from parents about how English language learners should be taught, this might cause for some further change in other states. Then looking at the special education timelines, we can see here that it goes back all the way to 1817 with the beginning of the American School for the Deaf, and many more things seem to have been happening in relation to special education. The last thing mentioned here on this timeline is the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004. What's not listed on here is in 2015, the most recent reauthorization was renamed as Every Student Succeeds Act. And that's just important to understand that those laws are always changing and growing. Looking at the United States, approximately 1 in 7 students that are receiving special education are also ELLs. Now, these statistics were collected from the 2017-2018 school year, and that showed the special education population, 13.6% were also ELLs. I think it was very interesting that even though this data was collected in 2017-18, it wasn't published until 2021, and when that data was released, it was already old data. So keep this in mind for later. Looking at the social context of oppression, it's important to look at how race and language are intertwined, especially for issues of racism. And some of these inequalities happen when you're looking at culture and language as in addition to disability identification. For example, Latinx children are rarely identified as having certain disabilities, such as emotional disturbances in the early years, but they're over-identified in other areas, such as having specific learning disabilities. How would an ELL be oppressed by getting special education services? Wouldn't they benefit from similar supports? How can oppression impact a child's learning? Even though students with special education services and those that are ELLs can benefit from the same instructional supports, developing language supports differs from supports for cognitive disabilities. How does that disability label impact an ELL's opportunities later? Children naturally work toward the bar is held by the people that believe in them. Where would you hold the bar for a child with a known cognitive disability? How would your expectations differ for someone that you believed was capable of understanding a concept if you could just communicate with them? These unconscious lowering of the bar is where the oppression begins. The inaccurate dual label of students in special education threatens the least restrictive environment of free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, and the social-emotional damage that occurs, not only for the student but also for their family, gives a stigma that is hard to overcome. Next, we're going to look at the social context of parent involvement. And some of the things we're going to talk about are the student as being the translator, some of the teacher perspectives, and the language differences that impact parent involvement. When parents cannot directly communicate with the school stakeholders, the hidden oppression gives more power to the school in making decisions. With the lack of shared communication between the parent and the educational representatives, many times the parents will default to the representative to make the quote-unquote informed decisions. Parents might feel that the school representative knows better since they are the educated one, creating a more of a power imbalance, where the closest to the culture and the language are essentially getting left out of the decision-making process, even if it is their own choice. Depending on the culture of the student parent, the family is entrusting the school system to make the best decision for their child in good faith. When a student is expected to be the translator for the teacher and for the parent, this further embeds a power imbalance and strips the parent of confidence to communicate effectively. A teacher that is given the power to be a decision maker may misinterpret the parent as uninvolved, someone who doesn't care, or someone who's uneducated. Culturally and linguistically, parents that cannot communicate with the English speakers are less likely to volunteer for school functions also. Then parents that don't volunteer may not experience the school culture as an active participant or as a community they belong to. Even if they participate in specific activities, they're isolated from the group as a whole. This is another form of oppression because families will be lacking a voice to make suggestions or contributions to rules and policies. Next, looking at the social context of underrepresentation of cultural alignment for student-teacher. Students that are ELLs are more often referred for special education when they're in monolingual programs. Then, when they're placed in more restrictive classroom environments through special education, when they really should be placed into bilingual programs. Monolingual teachers are less likely to come from the same background as the ELL, and bilingual teachers can relate to learning a second language. Statistically, monolingual teachers are white women. If we look here at this data point, it was pretty alarming to me. Again, data taken from 2017-2018 shows here that 79.3% of teachers are white. Then looking down here at this was also very interesting to me. This is the percentage distribution of teachers by race, ethnicity, and relationship to the race ethnicity of their students. So you can see here the comparison, which I thought was super interesting. The next thing I wanted to look at would be graduation rates and workforce entrance rates. We're going to look at the graduation rates for ELLs across the United States. And you'll see here for the school year 2017-2018, the English language learner high school graduation rates right here. And it's nicely color-coded to show us where the rates are very low in New York and where they're very high, West Virginia. Texas and New Mexico are about right here, a little over half. Then the next thing I wanted to look at has to do with the workforce for special education or for people, adults with disabilities by race and ethnicity. So here we're comparing the high school graduation rates of ELLs and the employment rates of individuals with disabilities by race and ethnicity. And the reason that we're not able to look at this as an intersection is because the data has not been published for ELLs that are also SPED. So this is a gap in information. I also wanted to mention that 86% of the average graduation rate, of that 89% is the rate for whites. And for special education, the average graduation rate is only 65%. So keeping those percentages in mind, we kind of have to look at this data and come to some conclusions on our own about how the intersectionality would impact not only the graduation, but also the workforce. Now to talk about some political factors. Looking at on the national level, the unofficial national language of English adds to the imbalance of power and the influence